separating essence from personality isn't just the key process. It's the only real process. It's the only meaningful process. Anything else that we might think is going on is merely personality playing its tricks, or personality engaging in its games. Personality is a kind of a tricky or twisted thing. It's tricky or twisted because it has a hidden agenda. So it has two things that it wants. One thing that personality, using the word in the Gurdjieffian sense, wants is to believe that it's striving heroically or trying to get somewhere, trying to improve itself, trying to change. So that's what it wants to believe. But even stronger than this is the fact that it absolutely doesn't want to change. The static identity, which is personality, only has one motivation, and that's not changing. That its motivation is that it should not change no matter what. Any talk of changing is frightening. For the static identity to change is for the static identity to cease being a static identity, obviously. And that means that change for the static identity means death. So that's a very absolute kind of a motivation on the part of personality. It really, really doesn't want to change. But it does want to make out that it's changing. So straight away we can see that personality, using the word in the Gurdjieffian sense, is a real tricky customer to be dealing with, because it'll hoodwink us the whole time. So this process whereby this personality hoodwinks us into thinking that we genuinely are engaged in trying to change, trying to get somewhere, is not a process. It's just us being tricked. But it's such a powerfully compelling and believable kind of a show that is being put on for us, that it's more than likely that we could spend our entire lives believing it. Even though if we were to objectively turn around and look at ourselves and see that actually nothing's really happening, nothing's any different, it's just all the same old ding-dong. But at any particular moment we're kind of hopeful with regard to change. We don't have this perception that it's all just the same old ding-dong, which would be a depressing perception as well as being a true perception. So that just goes to show that depression isn't necessarily a bad thing. And it also goes to show that hope isn't a good thing. Hope springs eternal, and so does self-deception. And seeing through this rigmarole, this perennial rigmarole, involves a lot of despair and depression and lack of hope, which is all very healthy. That's all very healthy stuff. We don't have to talk about this process in terms of personality and essence. It's not as if we're just going to try and follow whatever Gurdjieff said. That's just a way of illustrating it. If we do keep on using those words, they will very rapidly become meaningless to us anyway, which is something that Gurdjieff was well aware of. Had a terminology or a way of looking at the world when it's new to us, is powerful and can wake us up. And then very, very quickly, as we become familiar with it, the terminology rattles off our tongue in a habitual way, and we snooze. It causes us to snooze big time. We're snoozing away like anything by using habitual terminology. So that's a problem with the system, because all systems tend to be systematic and we're using the same words and we're not challenging ourselves in that way. So for that reason, all systems put us to sleep. What wakes us up is having to let go of systems, obviously enough, which is the thing we don't like. So another way of talking about this thing, this separation, is to talk about the separation of consciousness and rationality, or consciousness and the thinking mind. So these are two things which aren't the same at all, and they shouldn't be conflated, and yet they always are conflated, because no matter who you ask, they're going to be pretty hard pressed to try and say what the difference between consciousness and the rational mind is. They're kind of stuck together in our mind. And not only in terms of concepts, they really are stuck together. They're kind of glued together so that our consciousness can only go where, and it's not really right to say our consciousness, so as to imply that we possess it, or it's inherently got something to do with us. But consciousness can only go where the thinking mind says it's to go. So the thinking mind is the boss, it's the dictator. And so thought comes first, and awareness follows obediently in thought's footsteps. And that's not a good way for things to be, because thought is blind, thought is inherently limited, and all it can ever do is repeat itself over and over again, and in different ways it can rejig itself, it can reinvent itself in a trivial way, so that it keeps being entertaining for us. But all thought can ever do is repeat itself, and that's just another way of saying that thought can never be creative. There's no such thing as creative thought, even though we talk about creative thought. Thought is a logical process. It's based on rules. And it doesn't take too much to see that there's nothing creative about rules. The whole point of a rule is it's a rule. You don't do anything different, you just do what the rule says. And beyond any question, the thinking mind is based on rules. It's predicated upon rules. So a slightly different way of putting this is to say, we could say, that the thinking mind works by categorizing, and it categorizes everything. And this is the thinking mind's use. So I look at the world, which could very easily be a big multivalent blur of possibilities, confusing and overwhelming possibilities, superimposed possibilities. Sorry, not impossibilities. And that could be very confusing. So thought organises all of that, and it sweeps everything up like someone with a broom sweeping up dead leaves. It sweeps it all up into categories. It sweeps all the dead leaves up into neat piles. Admittedly, the wind will come and blow these piles all over the shop again, but then we'll get the broom and we'll sweep up the leaves again. So this has a utility because it helps us to make sense of the world and interact with it in a way that we can fulfill our agendas. So we know, all I'm saying there, I suppose, is just saying that thought makes a map, and that map's helpful for us to get from A to B. which is great. So that very neatly shows how thought is useful. And we can also very neatly see how thought is not useful. And all we have to do is consider that because what thought does is categorize, and I'm kind of pointing my thinking at the world and categorizing the world, thought will also do that with me. It'll turn around and it'll categorize us as well, of course. It categorizes everything. So what does that mean? It means thought turns me into a category. And if that doesn't sound good, it's because it isn't. Who wants to be a category? And yet this unwanted side effect or unwanted consequence has already happened. We've all been turned into categories. Every last one of us has been turned into a category, and the category in question is a very, very familiar category, which is called me, the me category. And this is such a familiar category that we don't even remember that it is a category. But of course it is. It's just a pile of leaves that's been swept together. And during the course of the day, this neat pile of dead leaves on the patio can get spread out all over the place, so it's not in such a neat pile all the time. And that's just a rather obscure way of saying that my sense of me can get leaky and it can lose its boundaries a bit. And that happens every time we kind of let go of our idea of ourselves in order to, or because we are actually genuinely interested in what's going on in the world around us, or what's going on with the world inside us. And at that point, we go outside of our category. And that kind of corresponds to what Scott Peck talks about, extending yourself. When we take an interest in someone else's reality and really do forget ourselves in the process, because it's not about us, we're extending ourselves. Now, it could be said that we've got a bigger self that includes other people. So we could say that, but at the same time, that may not be the best way to put it, because the self always gets to be the self by its neat and orderly boundaries. And we're not talking about changing the boundaries so that they include more, because then we could end up with something like a tribal group or a tribal identity. And a tribal identity is just as much a category, just as much as a deadening category as the individual ego, self, me category. There's absolutely no difference at all. It's just as toxic. And toxic might seem like a strong word to use, but the me is always toxic. It is a hive of toxicity. It generates toxicity by the lorry load. Ouspensky says the same. He says that whenever there is negativity, you know for sure it's coming out of the false self. There's nowhere else it can come out of. Absolutely nowhere else. All negativity comes out of the false self. It doesn't come out of who we are. It comes out of who we wrongly think we are. So whenever we experience negativity in ourselves, that can tip us off. Then here's the false self showing itself, just like a dirty old lorry going up a steep incline with a big load of stuff in it, and all these dirty old brown exhaust fumes full of nitrous oxide and other stuff are billowing out onto the street. And that's what the false self is like. So if you were to ask why the self or why the me should be toxic, it's very, very simple to answer. And the answer is that the me values itself, but it doesn't value what is not me. It doesn't value the other. So the other, in as much as I positively value myself because of the nature of the boundaries, that means I am disrespecting or disregarding or negatively valuing what is not me. And this is very obviously true. It's so true when it comes to tribal groups, whether they're football teams or religions or political tribal groups. The very existence of this identity means that the other is just as much as our identity is good and the right thing, the other is bad and not the right thing. So this really doesn't need for us to go into it too much, because all you have to do is think about the whole history of the human race and what else have we ever done but this particular game. The game of I'm right and you're wrong, or the game of me. Because me is a solitary kind of thing. It only cares about itself. And although the me can get very clever and put on a great act of caring about other things, who knows, the climate and injustices, all sorts of things. These are very fine things for the me to be interested and concerned in. And the me absolutely does need camouflage like this, because it's so very grotty itself. To be seen for what it is deeply uninspiring, to say the least, so it has to dress itself up. And it takes a huge interest in doing this, and at the same time it actually believes in its own bullshit. The self is notorious for believing in its own bullshit. So this is going off track very slightly, maybe more than slightly. But what this brings us to is to the point where we can see that to be a category is a crappy thing. To put it as simply as that. To be ruled over by the thinking mind is a crappy thing. And to be subsumed by what Gurdjieff calls personality is a deeply crappy thing. So the helpful thing, and there is only one helpful thing, as I started out by saying, is to separate personality from essence. Personality being who we falsely think we are, and essence being who we actually are. Or to separate consciousness from the thinking mind. Now, it's important to say that we're not talking about getting rid of personality or getting rid of the thinking mind. Only personality or only the thinking mind wants to get rid of things, or sees things as problems that need to be solved or errors that need to be fixed. We're not talking about that at all. We're talking about something which is non-aggressive and non-violent, and that is actually seeing that these two things are different things. And that isn't aggressive. That's very peaceful and non-obtrusive, non-intrusive. To aggressive in a psychological sense means that I want to change things from being the way that they are because I think the way that they are is bad or undesirable or wrong. So I try to change them. That's aggression. That's what we mostly do. Being conscious of the way things are is offering no violence to the way things are at all, because they are that way and we don't want them not to be that way. We're just seeing that they are that way. So the separation of personality from essence is not the result of aggression on our part. So it's a non-aggressive thing. And another way of putting this is to say that it's not the result of purposeful doing, because purposeful doing is aggression, of course. That's the very definition of purposeful doing, that it's aggression, that it is aggressive, that it's violence. In a psychological sense. In a non-psychological sense, it's perfectly legitimate in a lot of cases. But in a psychological sense, it never is legitimate. Which is to say, it's always aggression. It's always aggression, and it's always going to rebound on us, because aggression always rebounds on us. That's what it does. So the separation of consciousness from rationality, or personality from essence, isn't something that we can do. There's no way to do it. So that's good to know. We can forget about all of those methods that people are trying to sell us. There is no method to separate, because methods come out of personality. Methods are the epitome of the thinking mind. So we might quite understandably ask, well, how does the process come about then? And the answer is simply that this separation comes about all by itself, naturally, as a result of life, not as a result of our intention or agendas. So separation happens as a result of life. As long as we don't fight against it and prevent it from happening by holding on to what we think is us, which is the false self, what Ouspensky calls the false self, or what Gurdjieff calls personality. So as long as we don't hold on to that because we think it's who we are, and when we stop holding on to it, we can see that what life does in all its manifestations is to bring about the separation of personality and essence, or the rational mind and consciousness. Okay, thanks for watching.